Video, we're going to talk about translating your Photoshop design of a web page into Dreamweaver. So if you have a look at your PSD, the first thing you'll notice is its dimensions. So it's 1024 by 768, which is a fairly common monitor resolution or dimension. But importantly, as a designer, you remember that you need to be aware of what will be visible on that monitor resolution before any scrolling happens. And those sorts of figures we can get from various websites. So for example, Designer's Toolbox reminds you if you're designing for that res, then really your dimensions that you need to be aware of are those. And that's what I have here in Photoshop, 849 by 507. So we could drop down guides just to confirm that, etc. Apart from that, it's a pretty standard PSD document with just shapes and text for the various elements. So as I look at this and think about slicing it up to take it into Dreamweaver, I quickly realised there's not much I need to do. By that, what I mean is that the banner itself is really just a rectangle, which could easily be made as a div in Dreamweaver with a coloured background. The menu, of course, would best be created as a list item in Dreamweaver. The boxes, well, previously I might have needed to slice these out as images, but with CSS3, we can create curved corners, so it can be done by code. So the thing that I might start with exporting as an image is the gradient. Okay? So to do that, I've just used the slice tool, I've created a slice, and I've exported it out. Here I am in Dreamweaver, brand new HTML page, and the slice that I exported is sitting there and waiting. So we're going to create a style and apply that slice to the background. Now why am I doing it to the body? Why am I doing it to the body? Well, this way the gradient will fill the entire web page and not just a particular div. So it's going to be styling the body tag. And we'll start by pointing to that slice. And it should repeat, but if it doesn't, I'll just force it to repeat. And there we can see that little slice is being repeated on the X. And if we preview this, and it'll want me to save it. You might also notice that it's repeating down the page as well. Now, you might think that this looks a little bit hideous, and it does, but remember what's going on. We made it 507 pixels high, assuming that the user would be viewing the page on a monitor res where that would fit perfectly. But of course, I have my monitor res to set something much, much larger, as my other users, and so we start seeing the background being tiled down. So as a designer, what can you do to sort of minimize the visual ugliness of this? Well, coming back into Photoshop, it could be something as simple as rethinking your gradient. So here I have a different style of gradient that should tile better. The orange should match up with the orange down the bottom. So let's just quickly go and have a look at that. We can go in and modify the image. I already have that new slice sitting there. And already, even in Dreamweaver, it looks better. But when we preview it in the browser, you can see the change is a bit more subtle. But another way of doing your gradient apart from images is through CSS. So let's have a look at that. Essentially what you're going to do is still modify the body, but you're not going to be specifying an image. We're going to be using CSS code to create the gradient. Now this feature isn't available built into Dreamweaver yet. So what it entails is actually going out to the internet, close some of these down, and finding sites that allow you to create gradients. And there's a lot of these around. So in this case, I could go through and I could change the color of these gradients. I could be quite accurate by going into Photoshop and copying and pasting the hexadecimal value and pasting it into the online editor. And we'll just get rid of those. It's like watching paint dry. There we go. I'm making that white. So really, by going into Photoshop, sampling the colors, we can recreate the gradient. It also allows you to import from image. They're all different. Some are more advanced than others. But at the end of the day, what it does is provide you with the CSS. And in fact, this is quite nice because it provides you the CSS for older browsers, different versions, the WebKit, for Chrome, and there should be for Firefox, etc. So it's really quite good code. There are a couple of other little tweaks you might need to do, and I've actually done those previously, and I have my code sitting here. So I am going to go and grab, just got to make sure it's just the code that I needed for the gradient, which is there, and I'm going to replace the code that I already had here. Now, you might not have noticed that, but what's happened is we're no longer referencing the image, we're referencing that code we grabbed from the internet. And if we preview that in a browser, this gradient is not an image. This is simply being driven by CSS. The nice thing is you notice it's not tiling as well, and it just sort of fills up the page regardless of what, if you've maximized your window or what monitor resolution you're on. The next thing that we're going to recreate is a banner. So as I said, that really can be simply made by inserting a div and styling it and positioning it, etc. So let's start by doing that. I'm simply going to insert a div, which I can do through the insert menu or through this insert panel, and just hit OK. So there's our div. Right now it has the default content, so we can just change that. We can type in the word banner. But apart from that, it really has very little formatting or positioning, and that's because we don't have a style. So I'm going to now go and create a style, and then I'm going to attach it to this div. So new custom class, so just giving it my own name, so I'm going to call it my heading. Actually, you might call it my banner. Keep it consistent with the name in here. And types of things, of course, you could set is, the fonts and whatnot. We'll be talking more about using web fonts later on. But you could always start here, it's fine. Now I hit apply, and of course nothing updated because we haven't actually linked that style with that div. So what we can actually do now is highlight the div either in design or code view and say actually you need to be styled with that. So we're on the way now. As you can see, it's taken on the font. So other things that we can think about, of course, based on the box model, is the width. Remember, in Photoshop, we had a width. It was 849 pixels. So I can go back in here and recreate that. Pixels. A height of 70 pixels. Obviously, I'd want to check that. And you might think about just zeroing off margins and padding, etc. But you can come back to this at any stage. So I might just center that while we're there. And of course, the color. So as I was saying, we could go in here, we could sample the orange, copy it, and put that into the background color. So basically recreating what we had in Photoshop. Now the next element that we probably need to recreate is the navigation. Okay, so the easiest way that is to create a list item. That's just a standard industry practice. Now in Dreamweaver there are some tools that could help you. You could insert a ready-to-go spry menu library, and that will use this list approach and some JavaScript. Or you could open up one of the templates, and they will have navigation that you could copy and paste from. But really, I think the easiest way is to use one of the online resources and just sort of learn along the way what you're doing and how to modify it. So one that I like to use is Listomatic, and it just provides a couple of visual examples for you of what a nav might look like. I think that's suitable as a starting point for me. So it also provides the code. So it's as simple as grabbing the HTML and thinking, where do I want the nav to appear? Well, semantically, it should appear after the banner. Okay, that sort of makes sense. We had the banner, and then underneath it we have the nav. These things can be positioned later on, but it should also try to make sense in your HTML structure. So there's our list. Of course, it doesn't look anything like the nav because it doesn't have the styles. And what the styles do is sort of specify things like colors, but it also floats each little list item up, and that's what creates the horizontal aspect. And it sets widths and heights and those sorts of things. So we can just copy that, and of course you need to know where you're putting it. It's going to be at the end of the existing styles, which at the moment for me are all in this document, in the head of the document. So there you go. Now, it will take a little bit of time for you to become familiar with what each one of the styles is doing. So for example, this is styling the box that the list is in. So I can go and sample my color and grab it. It's just really about knowing that you're using hexadecimal colors. There we go. And then that the hyperlink itself, so when the user clicks on, is also needing to be changed. It's got 3 digits because it's shorthand. 6 digits is longhand for the colors. And obviously you could go in and style the font, etc. And probably best to adjust the styles wherever they are. So the font is being set at the overall container level, and we can set a size. I know I'm just going to use pixels even though it's not best practice for the moment. And you can go and modify those list items. So, mimicking whatever was in the Photoshop about work, etc. Now, the only other thing is perhaps the positioning. We'll be talking about that in the future, but for the moment, I'm going to quickly modify the positioning of that nav to give it some position. And I think we need to move it up a little bit. That'll do. So if we preview this, it should be looking a little bit like our Photoshop document. But there are a few improvements we can make. At the moment, the nav obviously hasn't had a width set, but if it did, we could see that this would look reasonably okay on the monitor res that we had designed for. That is, if my monitor was set to 1024 by 768, the website would fit quite nicely in it. However, I, like many users, might have their monitor set to anything, and it's a much higher res. So what I'd like to do is position this in the center so that regardless of what size it is, it sort of floats in the middle at the higher res. And if they have the correct res, then it'll fit nicely. So to do that, we're going to create another div. And this div, we're going to wrap around the 2 existing ones. So just remember, it's nice to use like the inspect, just to confirm for yourself what divs you do and don't have. So at the moment, we really just have 2. One's a banner, and you can space this out if it's easier, and one is the nav. So I want to wrap another div around the 2 of those. I can highlight them, insert div, and you can see it's already recognized that I'm wrapping. Now, if I had a style, I could choose it from the drop-down box, but I haven't made the style for this wrapper div yet, so I'm going to make a new one. And I'm going to call it wrapper. You'll often see this. It's not actually a technical term. It just makes sense to humans. And I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to give it a position. So if you don't have position specified, it actually is static by default. And what that means is you can't put width and height, and you certainly can't move the element around on the page. So relative is a great choice to start with, and that's what I'm going to do there. So my wrapper should only ever be 849 pixels wide because I've said that that's sort of the target monitor res that I'm aiming for. The height I'll leave by default. It'll be as big as the elements inside of it, and I'll just push it down to be the right size. The other thing that I'd like to do now is just set some left and right margins to auto, and what that will do is actually center that div. So I'm going to hit OK. And you probably have seen it's sort of centered it, and those elements are now inside of the wrapper div. And let's preview that. So it looks good at the lower res, and now it's just going to be centered regardless of what dimensions. And what you would have noticed is that I didn't have to set the size of the navigation div. Remember, it was pointing, it was too long. It has actually inherited the width of its parent element. Remember, its parent element is now the wrapper. It sits inside of the wrapper. So the navigation container div, because we didn't have a width set, has said, okay, I need to be the width of my parent. Its parent is the wrapper, and the wrapper has a width set of 849 pixels. Nice. What we're going to look at now is recreating these text areas, or content areas. But before we do that, I just want to do a quick overview of the positioning that we've used with our divs currently. So we have three divs. Remember, we have a wrapper, and that's the wrapper. And inside of the wrapper is the My Banner div, and then there's also the navigation div. So what sort of positioning do we have? Well, on the wrapper, it was relative. On My Banner, we don't actually have any positioning. And what that means is that I can't set its position. I can't move it around unless I choose some positioning. So if I went into modify and I said, let's make it relative, what I'd be able to do now is move it down 20 pixels. The important thing to realize is that the relative positioning occurs from the position that the element would have had originally in the flow of the document. So when we say let's move it down a certain amount of pixels from the top, we're saying move it from where it would have existed earlier, from the top of from the position of its top in the normal flow of the HTML document, and then it will position it down 20 pixels from where the top would have been. Now that's the case for sort of relative elements. Absolute elements can actually get their positioning from the parent element. So we've mentioned the usefulness of the relative positioning, but let's just compare it to absolute positioning. So remember, at the moment, these are both relatively positioned. Okay? And just to recap, one of the strengths of that, if we go to Banner and we change its height to 200, because these are both relatively positioned, the nav has just reflowed to follow on from the banner. So it doesn't matter how big I've made that height, the nav will just go, oh, it's changed and I just need to move down in the flow of the page. So that can be sort of useful when you're designing websites that need to sort of reflow across different monitor resolutions or devices. But more on that responsive design later. But that point was useful to consider if we contrast it to, I'll just undo that. Okay. If we contrast it to absolute. So if I made the banner absolute rather than relative, what happens? Well, what you'll notice is that the nav has actually jumped to the top of the wrapper. When you make an element absolute, as we have done with the banner, it's almost as though you take it out of the flow. The elements following it or around it really just don't see it anymore. You can see it's almost as though the nav element here cannot see the banner element anymore because it's absolute. It's as though it's been pulled out of the page. And so it goes, oh, there's nothing there. I must need to jump up and sit underneath the wrapper. So both of those are really quite powerful. and there's no set rule of when you will use them. Both will allow you to move your elements around as you need. So even right now with absolute, I could push that down, right down the page. But it's really the difference of how the other elements work with an element that's set to absolute. Remember, if it's relative, they would just sort of flow around each other, whereas if it's absolute, you take it out of the flow and you position it in a really specific spot. But there are a number of resources that will help you begin to understand the differences. And I know we've looked at these in class, and I'll just send you back to those and try some of the examples that they have. Okay, so now we're going to add those div elements that contain the content in the Photoshop layout. So let's begin by inserting a div, and it should happen semantically. By that I mean we had our banner first in the HTML, then we have our navigation. So it makes sense that the content will come after the nav, but before the close of the wrapper. So I'm going to insert a div. And once again, I don't have a class ready for it, so let's just make one. And call that my protein to 1. And we can set a color. Now I'll just pick one. Obviously we could sample it. And the other things we can do is set a width and height, I suppose. So once again, ideally I would go into Photoshop and work out roughly what these dimensions are. So 226, 237 roughly. 226. We'll just make it a square. And we'll hit apply and OK. Now it's created the content box, and it's actually got the same background color in there. And it has positioned it semantically directly after the navigation. It might appear that this is incorrect, but remember you should always look at things in the live view. So we can see that indeed our content div has appeared directly underneath the nav, which is semantically where it sits in the HTML, and we've given it a width and a height. So if I wanted to position it now, I could go in and do that. So let's go in and edit. Now remember, if you don't specify a position, it will by default be static. And with static, you can't actually use the top, bottom, etc. Placement. So you can see I've asked it to go 50 pixels down, but it won't do that. It will, however, do it if I say relative. So let's update that. What you'll notice though is that our content is now sort of going past the height of our wrapper. So it's probably worthwhile having a look to see if we have any height set. No, we only have a width. And ideally, we'll make it the 507 that our Photoshop design had specified. Okay, so our content is sitting inside of there. So if you get the idea now of the content, that you can position it using the top, left, right, bottom. So we'll just show another example of that. So from the left, alternatively, you can actually push elements away from other elements using their margin, because remember it sits outside of the border area. So I could say 50, and it's moved that down as well. And visually, we can see that this now has got a margin on it. I'm just going to remove some of those large margins. Just make that 0, and its positioning 0, left margin, top 0. And we'll just preview that. So it is sort of overlaying the navigation. That's more to do with how the navigation is made rather than that position. So what we'll do is give it a little bit of a push down, just so it doesn't confuse you when I'm talking about it. There we go. So that's a relatively positioned div. Now, what we can do is copy and have multiples of these. So I might do well, let's do 2 to begin with. Okay. So they are following each other semantically. Here is a div with a certain size and height, and it's got no positioning other than the very first one, which was from the top of the element preceding it. Now, if we wanted to have this second div go to the right, we would normally create a second class. So you would do my content 2 and position it differently. In fact, we might just do that. So I can quickly do this by changing the div, duplicating. It just saves me going through those steps of making a new one. And if I said content 2 should now sit from the left 300 pixels, and we could position it back up, and we can actually do negatives. You get the idea that we could create its own class and position the div. And I'll leave that there, but what I want to do is actually just show you another method. So if we go in and modify some of the properties around this content, now we haven't talked about margins, but we could set that. So remember, from the left we could push it away from the edge of the wrapper, and they've both moved in. Or we could add a little bit of a margin to the top, and that gives it a little bit of spacing. But the thing that I was going to show you is the float option. So in addition to setting relative positioning and either using the placement option or margins to maneuver the element, the float is a really powerful way of getting an element that would normally just follow on. So that's all it's doing here. It's going, there's a div, and having it position itself up next to the element that it's closest to in the code. So in this case, if I tell it to float to the left and apply, what's happened is this one has jumped up and it's now sort of floating. And if we had multiples of these, they would continue to do that. So float is another powerful way of positioning. And they will float until there is no more space. So we can only fit 3 across in this wrapper, and so the 4th one is now being pushed down below. Okay, so in most cases you'll use the relative positioning, but you can also use absolute. So let's have a quick talk about that. So let's make a new div, and this one's going to be hypothetically for, oops, I don't have one ready to go. We need to create a new one called logo, a custom class. We'll just give it a background color so we can actually see what it's doing, and some width and height. And we'll position it relatively. And it's doing strange things here. But in most, it's because we've got elements being positioned. Remember, we're floating these and they have all sorts of margins, etc. When you look at it structurally, you can see that the logo does indeed follow on in the HTML after the last content box. But because we've started adding styles, they're sort of cancelling each other out. And you'll find that that does happen. Semantically, though, it probably makes sense to have that logo up near the top anyway, but still within the wrapper. But as you can see, because it's in the HTML here, what it's now doing is pushing down the banner. Remember, these are all relative. So as soon as we add an element, all the other ones will want to sort of flow around it. And in this case, that's not what I want to do. In this instance, it's really useful to not have the logo div positioned relatively, but to use absolute. Because if you remember from earlier on, I said when we make something absolutely positioned, we take it out of the flow, and it's as though the other elements no longer see it. So let's just do that now. So quickly with the logo, make it absolute. And perhaps the only other thing, let's preview it, I suspect we'll need to set the Z index. Preview in browser. Right, so we can't see the logo, but it is no longer pushing down the banner. So let's quickly find the logo and change its Z index so we can bring it on top. Now they're actually overlapping, so we'll set it to 1. Excellent. So if that sort of makes sense, that element now is absolutely positioned and it's no longer going to sort of interrupt or get in the way of any of the other elements. Okay, so now for some finishing touches, the curved borders for the content divs. Now this feature isn't available in Dreamweaver as yet, and so what we'll do is go and grab the code from the internet. So W3 Schools is as good a place as any. And what we're looking for is the CSS we need for rounded corners. In this case, it really just is a modification of the border styles. So if we copy this, and you'll see there's 2 lines, there's one for borders in general, and then there's a fix for Firefox, which we know because it has the moz in front of it. So you can style borders in Dreamweaver, but you can see there's only the style, the width, and the color. There's nothing about the curves. Okay? So it's not to say we couldn't choose these, but in addition to these, we might like to use this curved option. So I need to go and find the styles for that content div. So that's it there, my content, and paste it. Perhaps I did not put it in the right place. My content div, we'll just check. Content 1, yes. Border radius. And live view. That's right. So it doesn't always show in Dreamweaver. And then there are other little tweaks, of course, that you could consider, like the padding, etc., because obviously that text is now too close to the corner and so on. But hopefully you're feeling a little bit more confident with adjusting these sorts of things. So just pulling the text away from the border a little bit. Okay, with this last video, I just want to introduce the concept of responsive or fluid design. When we've been previewing this layout, you'll notice that if we resize it, aspects of it get cut off. On a desktop, well, it's fine. We've sort of designed for a certain monitor resolution. But what if we were viewing it on an iPad or on a mobile phone? Users would have to scroll and its usability would be minimized. Now, a lot of this has got to do with actually the unit of measurements we might be using. Most of our dimensions that we had initially set were in pixels because that's what we designed for in Photoshop. But if we were to go through and change the 849 pixels that we had earlier to 80%, and likewise just tell our banners to be a certain percentage, what we're doing is moving from a fixed unit of measurement, a pixel, to a flexible unit of measurement, a percentage. Now I've quickly done that just to show you an example. This is the same site, but now the units of measurement are in percentages. Look what happens when we start resizing. The banner has resized, the navigation has resized, and our relatively positioned divs have floated down. Not everything is resized. Our wrapper obviously needs to go the entire area. And the usability of the navigation is perhaps an issue now that it's resized. But it gives you the idea how you could have one product, one website perhaps, that would be viewable across the different devices with their dimensions. But there's a lot more to responsive design. And that's it for this video. Thank you.